Hi, I'm Gordon Weiner, Research Director at the Marketing Science Institute. As many of you know, MSI is a nonprofit that serves as the bridge between marketing theory and business practice, and our goal is to move the needle on significant marketing problems. We do this by funding research by leading academics worldwide on topics that have been voted on by our 60-plus corporate sponsors, and then disseminating that research through members-only events and a variety of different kinds of publications. I'm very pleased to welcome you to another MSI For Members by Members webinar. This is a series of webinars on subjects related to MSI's current research priority topics. First, I'd like to point out the Chat with Presenter function in the left-hand corner of your screen. Please use this feature to send through any questions you have for Spencer, our speaker, during the presentation. We'll gather the questions and have a brief Q&A following the presentation. Now I'd like to introduce you to our featured speaker. He is Spencer Harrison, Associate Professor at Boston College Carroll School of Management. And the title of his talk today is Curiosity, Where Are You? Spencer, currently at the Carroll School, will soon be an Associate Professor of Management at INSEAD. He teaches classes on organizational behavior and managing creativity and innovation. He also works with organizations to help them understand their culture and how their culture enables growth and innovation. Prior to his academic career, he worked as a project manager and instructional designer for Franklin Covey and as a change consultant for Maxcom, Inc. His current research examines how organizations harness individual vitality, exploring topics like the role of curiosity, creative work, and the role of hope in an organization. And he examines these topics in a wide array of organizations, from rock climbing equipment design and manufacturing, call centers, graphic design studios, and in the wide array of professions, medical imaging, modern dance, and handmade craft work. He has degrees from the University of Utah, Brigham Young, and a PhD from Arizona State's Carey School of Business. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to Spencer.
Thank you so much. It really is a pleasure for me to be involved with MSI, and I just love what this community is doing. I think it's such a fabulous marriage of science and practice, and it's really a joy for me to get to talk to you all today. And I want to talk about a topic that's kind of near and dear to my heart. It's one that I've been exploring for the past decade. And let me start by telling a little bit of a story. So my youngest son has kind of an odd name. His name is Bridger. So that's like the word bridge, but with an R at the end. Now, growing up, I would spend a few weeks each summer at my grandfather's cattle ranch in Star Valley, Wyoming. And when you sit on the porch at night and stare at the mountains to the east, you're actually staring at what's called Bridger National Forest. So we named Bridger after that beautiful spot and that fun set of family memories. But Bridger National Forest itself is actually named after a man named James Felix Bridger. He was an American mountain man who's described as the father of the tall tale. Jim Bridger would tell a story that went something like this, and he became fairly famous for it. He's alone in the wilderness. He realizes he's being chased by his enemies. He runs. His enemies are bearing down on him. He's grossly outnumbered. First it's a few, then it's 100. He tries to elude them. He runs into a deep canyon. He's running away. He hears them getting closer, and all of a sudden he comes to a dead end in the canyon. He's surrounded. His enemies are getting closer and closer, and at this point, Bridger would go silent. You can imagine him telling this sort of a story at a kind of an old Western bar, and eventually some listener would say, well, then what happened next? And James Felix Bridger would reply, they killed me. Now, this is an example of this sort of a story where he's telling something imaginative and kind of being hyperbolic. But the point of the story was to not give somebody all the information, to make them curious, to make them want to know what happened next. And he was playing off of their curiosity to kind of pull them into his story. And it's dynamics like that that have made me really interested in how curiosity works and what it can do for us at work. How do we find pieces of missing information, and what do we do when we find those pieces of information? How might that be helpful for organizations, and how might that hinder organizations? Now, if we look at the way curiosity plays out at work, there are many organizations that espouse curiosity either as a core value or have compelling quotations from founders or prominent executives where they have argued that curiosity is an element of what has allowed them to perform well, to be innovative, and to compete in a dynamic global environment. Just for fun, I'd like to focus in on two of these examples, Merck and Olivetti. Now, Merck is a company that I think most of us are familiar with. It's a German multinational pharmaceutical and chemistry company, and it employs more than 50,000 people worldwide. What is kind of surprising when you dig into the history around Merck is that it's also the oldest pharmaceutical company in the world. Merck was actually founded in 1668 as an apothecary shop. So you can imagine walking into the original shop that was Merck, and if you play that forward several hundred years to where we are today, the industry and what it takes to compete in the pharmaceutical industry has seen massive amounts of changes. In fact, Merck's history would incorporate kind of the tail end of the Renaissance, the emergence of science as a field of study, as well as the Industrial Revolution and our recent revolution toward globalization. So it's interesting that we have this company that's been able to survive all that upheaval in an extremely dynamic competitive industry. In a recent report, Merck executives observed that curiosity has been part of the organization's DNA from the beginning. And they singled out curiosity as an important core characteristic that has allowed the organization to be adaptive and to continue to evolve over time. Olivetti is perhaps a slightly lesser known company, but has a similar sort of a story. Olivetti was founded in 1908 in a small town in Italy by a father and son. At the time, typewriters were kind of cutting-edge technology, but we know that over the last 100 years, they've been completely displaced by computers. So it's odd then that Olivetti has continued to persist as a profitable company. I found an article a few years ago where Olivetti was sponsoring a local art exhibition at the local museum, and a reporter posed a question to one of their executives wondering, why would a typewriter company invest in an art exhibition? And the executive replied, our company is fueled by curiosity. We hope our employees will go and look at the art and that will make them ask bigger questions. So you can see across these examples that there is this very strong sense that curiosity, which we'll kind of identify here as this magnifying glass, it's kind of the desire to explore, to look deeply into things, to find out new information, that curiosity is connected to this sense of insights that lead to innovation, that lead to growth, that lead to adaptation, that curiosity can kind of be the upstream fuel for downstream behaviors that we really need in today's modern organization. What's interesting then is that in a recent large survey, most employees that responded noted exactly this. They felt that curious people bring in new ideas, that they are profoundly important for organizations because they generate the grist that allows organizations to adapt. But what was sad is that this same group of people felt like they weren't curious. They only felt that 22% of the people were curious on a given day. And so this leads to this kind of interesting sort of gap where we know that curiosity is really important, but a lot of people don't feel like they are very curious in their jobs, and they're not sure exactly how they could become more curious. And it's that sort of insight that's kind of led me to want to explore this topic in more detail. And what I'd like to do is kind of outline a series of studies that I've done over the past 10 years that help begin to show how curiosity works in organizations and what the outcomes of curiosity are, but also give you some insights as leaders and managers into what you can do to help your people be more curious and to create an organization where curiosity can thrive. So let me start at what was the beginning for me. When I began studying curiosity, I actually wanted to go to an organization where I thought curiosity would not be rewarded, where curiosity would be kind of driven out by the fact that the work itself would be so well prescribed that people wouldn't have a chance to ask questions. And so I did an initial study in a series of 10 different organizations that heavily relied on call centers. So we were looking at the call center employees. And the reason why these companies were interested in studying this is that, as many of you probably know, call centers experience a high degree of turnover because the job is heavily structured. Some people have described it as like having an assembly line in your brain. You have a script that you're supposed to follow with customers. You need to be calling very quickly because your calls are monitored and because your frequency of calling is also monitored. And so in this setting where it's so heavily controlled, the question was, would curiosity exist? And if it did, would it have any sort of a positive impact on people? So what we did is we measured people's curiosity by having them fill out a survey before they began working in these call centers. And then 4 weeks in to their job at the call center, we had them report on different activities that they were performing, activities around how they were learning their job, where they were seeking information, how they were becoming more socialized, or describing their onboarding process at work. What we found that was really exciting for us was that not only were these people curious, but that their curiosity had a huge impact on their performance. The people that were the most curious when they were hired by these companies were also the ones that sought the most information from the people that they worked around. And then they were best able to use that information in a way that allowed them to be creative on their job. In fact, what we found for some of these people when we did follow-up interviews was that their curiosity allowed them to see their job less as this assembly line in their brain, but actually more like a game, like a maze that they were exploring, and they were trying to figure out new ways of using the system that was prescribed to them, but in different ways so that they could get better results for the customers that they were dealing with. And these people became the highest performers at work. So we were excited. We had found this kind of preliminary evidence that people that were more curious at work were actually providing results that were really important to organizations, even in a setting where you would expect that a lot of curiosity was being extinguished because it was so prescriptive and it was doing such a good job of trying to help their employees be efficient. Now for us, this raised this really kind of interesting question where what we were looking at was what we might call trait curiosity. We're looking at kind of a stable disposition that each of us have toward being more or less curious. But what's important is that if you think about a moment in your lives when you were curious, it's not something that's kind of stable or that is kind of constantly at the same level. It's something that gets excited by pieces of information that are presented to you. In fact, I would hope some of you are on this call because you're curious, and so you wanted to learn a little bit more. And so it made me wonder what could lead people to experience states of curiosity a little bit more frequently. And so I embarked on another study. And this time I used an opposite sort of a logic. Whereas in the first study I picked a population of people that were kind of less likely to be curiosity as a more stringent test of what curiosity might do in organizations. In this case I wanted to find people that were more frequently curious so I could actually kind of capture that moment of curiosity as it was happening. So I was able to get about 300 people that had stores on Etsy. Now if you've never used Etsy, you should. It's an amazing site. It allows people that make handmade craft goods or artistic items, and then they can open their own store and sell them to the general public. It's a really fun community and environment. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to see, in comparison with the call center employees, where we were kind of getting curiosity as a stable trait, I wanted to find states of curiosity. What would happen day to day as these people were curious, and how would that impact what was going on in their stores? So one of the great things about this environment is that Etsy is this amazingly supportive community, but it also allows an enormous amount of transparency. As a buyer, I can see how many sales an individual store has had, how many people heart those sales, so if those sales actually led to customers being super satisfied. And I can also have dialogue with other people in the community that are making similar things. And so what this does is it creates a sense of competition between these members to try to make the best goods and to have the most delightful customer experience. And what I asked these people to do was to fill out a short survey one time per day. So we were trying to capture curiosity as it was happening. We would ask them to rate a series of measures to measure how curious they were, and then we would ask them to describe what was happening to them during the day. The other thing that we were doing is we were capturing these statistics from their stores, so we could actually see, were they posting new items to their website? How many sales were they getting? How many people loved those sales? What we were able to do then, by gathering all this data over the course of 2 weeks, was to go back and see when were the moments when they were most curious, what was driving that curiosity, and then what were the results of that curiosity. And what we found was that people were most curious on days when they were surprised, days where they were encountering something that was new, that was novel, that was slightly unexpected. And so these surprises were then kind of leading to these daily spikes in curiosity. And what was also amazing to us is that when we looked at the outcomes of the curiosity in this setting, what we found was that the more curious you were as an Etsy store owner, the more new items you actually developed for your store, which then led to an increase in sales. So these individuals experiencing these surprises, it actually led them to rethink their business, to create new items, and then to generate more sales. What was also really interesting here is that surprise is kind of a peculiar emotion. In fact, just yesterday, I was reading on PLOS ONE, which is an open source research website, and there was an article that was looking at all of the emotions that are described in the Finnish language. And what they found was there were 3 emotional categories. There was a negative emotional category that included words like anger, anxiety, hatred. There was a positive emotional category which included things like excitement, happiness, and joy. And then there was a third category that they called the surprise category, which included wonder and interest. What's cool then is that as they mapped out the terrain of these different emotions, and this has been replicated in all sorts of different cultures, is that surprise contains the seeds of both excitement and anxiety. It's actually a highly ambivalent emotion. It's an emotion that includes the positive energy around what might I discover, what is this new thing, but also the anxiety of, is this new thing potentially dangerous? Could it hurt me? And because surprise activates both of those things, it's a really important adaptive emotion. It's something that notifies us that there's things in our environment that are asking us to more fully explore what is going on. So what I found then was this kind of cool piece to the puzzle, that if we want to be more curious and we want to get these important outcomes from curiosity, we need to be able to have more surprises. Now in subsequent studies, we've actually tried to look at what allows people to be surprised. And what's interesting then is that when you look at most of the literature around effective leadership and effective managers, a lot of it actually encourages managers to eliminate surprises. The idea is that you're a good manager as much as you're able to plan and foresee things, so much so that you eliminate the possibility of surprise for those people that follow you. But what we've found in subsequent studies when we've asked people to describe surprises at work, and these are in moments where they're undergoing significant organizational change, so people that are onboarding to a new organization, people whose organization is undergoing an organizational transformation to a new strategy, or even people that are in an organization that has recently been acquired by another organization, we find that about 50% of the surprises that people describe, even in circumstances that seem very averse, are actually pleasant surprises where they're excited about what's happening. And so this kind of pass-on wisdom that surprise is anathema to good leadership seems to be false. Employees actually want to be surprised, and they especially want to have these sorts of pleasant surprises. Now that raises the question, what leads these people to have pleasant surprises, especially in these averse circumstances? And when we drilled into the descriptions of people that were experiencing these surprises a little bit more, what we found is that pleasant surprises happen most frequently when people are in an environment where they feel a sense of relational support, or what we might call psychological safety. So if you imagine if you're seeing something new for the first time, that can be a potentially scary thing. But if you're seeing something new and you're surrounded by friends, then you feel so much support that you can explore what that new thing is. In fact, there's a study of infants, so babies that are around 6 months old, and you can show the baby something new. And the immediate reaction is this kind of surprise face that we have with the cat up here. But what happens is the baby will make the surprise face looking at the new object, and then they'll immediately train their eyes on their parents. And if the parent makes a sad face or a face that evokes negative emotion, then the child's surprise face will then quickly transform into a negative emotional face. If the parent makes an excited face, then that surprise transfers into positive excitement. In fact, so much so that in a study by some MIT graduates, they found that if you take a face expressing emotion and you blend it with surprise, that's the hardest thing for people to identify what the emotion is, because surprise is so readily transferable to other emotions. So surprise is a super important opportunity for generating curiosity. And one of the ways that we generate surprise as managers is by creating a supportive context where people feel like they are in a group of friends, where they feel a sense of safety, and that allows them to explore things that stand out, things that seem novel, things that seem new, even in circumstances where they might feel like the entire organization itself is changing around them. So moving on then, it led me to wonder about this kind of second arrow that we see between the magnifying glass and the light bulb. We now have a better sense of what leads people to these moments of curiosity and how we can create those moments of curiosity for individuals, so how we can allow our employees to have more frequent states of curiosity at work. But the question is, what links curiosity with these sorts of creative outputs that organizations want? So to figure that out, we've run a set of experiments. And we did so using this really interesting story. So most of us are familiar with Harry Houdini. He was an incredibly successful illusionist at the turn of the 19th century. And one of his most famous illusions was making an elephant disappear. In fact, he would go on stage at what was called the Hippodrome in New York, and he would bring out Jenny, the vanishing elephant. And she would come out on the stage, and we'd have a huge box, and they would spin the box around so that the audience could see that it was just a box and there was kind of no spot for the elephant to hide. He would bring the elephant into the box. He would turn the box all the way around, and by the time the box came back around to the audience, the elephant was now gone. And the audience was amazed. It was one of his biggest tricks. It was one of his most famous tricks. Now, magicians are really interesting folks, and they have a very strong code of conduct. And what was interesting is that this particular trick, the secret to it wasn't revealed for over 90 years. In fact, the secret wouldn't have been revealed except that the original innovator of the trick, who had sold it to Houdini, had written it down in his journals. And years later, his great nephew was going through his personal effects and found a diary where this man described creating this trick. So this man was from Yorkshire, England. His name was Charles Morritt, and he was an illusionist who just didn't have a good stage charisma. And so as a result, as his kind of career was moving on and he realized things were passing him by, he was contacted by a friend of Houdini's who said, look, Houdini is looking into doing these sort of bigger illusions. Can he buy a trick from you? And Charles Morritt sold him the secrets to doing this trick. Now what we did in an experiment was we showed people two different versions of Houdini's trick. In one description, we allowed them to see exactly how the trick was done. And in the other, we didn't tell them how it was done, and we let them guess. After we let them see each of these two descriptions, we asked them to describe a new magic trick that Harry Houdini should be considering. And then we asked them to take a few minutes and just describe the thought process they went through in trying to decide on a new idea that Harry Houdini should create. We then hired a set of 3 independent magicians to look over the tricks that were suggested by these participants and to have them rate those based on how new or creative the tricks were. What we found was that the people that were shown Harry Houdini's trick and saw a description of how the trick were performed, they were less curious about how to do magic, because for them it kind of seemed very obvious how to do this sort of a trick. As a result, the tricks they described were rated as less creative by the magicians. They were also smaller in scale if we use elephants as kind of a size comparison. And they were more fixated on using boxes, using elephants, and making things disappear. The group of people that weren't told how Houdini did the trick came up with radically different ideas. And those ideas were rated as much more creative by the magicians that were rating, and the tricks themselves were actually larger in size and were less likely to have to do with disappearance, with elephants, or with boxes. So you can see that they were actually able to move away from this original idea into kind of more virgin territory. Now what was important for us was looking at the descriptions that they gave us of how they were getting to these ideas afterwards. And what we found was the people that were told how to do the trick settled on the original trick and kept kind of focusing on that same set of ideas. But the people that hadn't been told how to do it made more what we call associational links. So they would start with the elephant and with the box, but then they would move to other things like, well, I wonder what's bigger than an elephant. Maybe it's a dinosaur. You know what would be even more interesting than a dinosaur, but a fossil of a dinosaur. And then what if instead of making the fossil disappear, you're actually able to animate the fossil and to make it move on stage? So you can see that by making those associational links, they were able to move away from the raw materials into a completely new idea. So this was really exciting for us because we were able to see now what is the link between curiosity and these sorts of creative behaviors we want. And we found that it was this ability to make more associational links. Now, what we wanted to do was to figure out how would that roll out inside an organization. And so we were contacted by an organization that explicitly told us we want to be more curious as an organization. This is an organization that's based in the northeastern United States, and they have an amazing mission. Their goal is to end homelessness. That's also a very complex problem. And what the organization wanted to do was to figure out if they could make their employees more curious, would they then be accessing more raw material and have more creative ideas and more opportunities to help make a big impact on this problem. So they were really willing to play with us and to come up with kind of new ways of engaging their employees and trying to help them be more curious. And what we did was what we would call a field experiment, where we gave one half of the organization a training on common practices that we see in almost every organization. We talked with them about goals, about roles, and about how organizations as a whole work together. So we called that the GROW method, G-R-O, goals, roles, and organization as a whole. And we gave another group of employees that were randomly selected the exact same content, but we used it in a very different way. We presented it through what we called a go-back methodology, where we would present them kind of typical content, but then show it in a very different way. If you think about goals, for example, most of us are used to our manager kind of describing what the goal for the department is, and then we have to decide how that cascades down into our individual goal. And that's one way that goals work in organizations, and that's a way that kind of reinforces this notion that organizations are an extremely stable, almost permanent sort of a place. But another way is realizing that goals are actually fairly ephemeral things, and they're things that we create and that we can co-create. And that if we go back to our goal and we question the assumptions that we have and the ideas that we have behind the surface, they can actually allow us to create new goals. So for example, one instance that we used to describe this a little bit better was a scientist that was trying to help people that had cerebral palsy or other sorts of diseases where it was causing their extremities to shake. And so you can imagine that if you've got a disease like this and you try to eat cereal in the morning for breakfast, it's very hard to do because the food splashes all over the place. And so initially the idea was, how can we create a drug that's going to stop these tremors? But as he went back and began to question, what are the assumptions, what are the ideas that are going on behind this goal of stopping the tremors, and he realized that the goal wasn't to stop the tremors within the body per se, but to just stop the tremors themselves. And in thinking about that, it freed him up of thinking about a pharmaceutical way of engaging the problem and to think of a more mechanical way of engaging the problem. And the solution that he came up with was having a gyroscope attached to a spoon so that the spoon itself was actually moving and absorbing the tremors and thereby making a spoon that was solid in nature. Well, what happened was when we gave these two groups of employees at the company these different sorts of trainings, and these were all done online. They took on average about 10 minutes. What we found was that the employees that got this training where they were encouraged to go back and rethink of these organizational elements less as stable things, but more as things that could be fluid or that could evoke surprises, they were better able at making these sorts of associational links. In fact, what we found was that these people were rated by their managers as being more creative and more innovative. But more important than that, we actually were able to have access to the emails that people were sending to each other, not the content of the emails, but just who they were connecting to. And so we could draw a network of the organization itself. And what we found was that people that became more curious as a result of this training dramatically changed the way they engaged with the entire organization. They expanded their networks. They sent more emails to more people, and as a result, they were actually able to gather more information, and that's what led to them being more creative. So just as a review then, what we found is that curiosity is amazingly important in organizations. It works both in highly creative contexts like Etsy. It also plays an important role in less creative organizations where it allows people to actually be more efficient and more effective on their job. The research clearly shows that surprises allow people to be curious, and that as managers, rather than trying to dampen surprises and trying to plan everything, allowing organizations and our employees to experience surprise can be extremely positive. And finally, by training people to be curious and by allowing them to look at taken for granted elements of their organizations in new ways and see the fluidity and the potential for turbulence under that, we can actually change the way people engage with the organization and engage with each other, allow them to be more networked, get more energy from each other, and come up with more creative solutions. And with that, I would like to end the formal portion of the presentation and open the floor to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Spencer. It's Gordon again. Let me just remind everybody in the audience to please send questions through the chat with presenter function on the left-hand corner of your screen. And let me begin with a question. I'm kind of curious. When you do this kind of training in organizations, are there some people that are more susceptible or open to it versus others? In other words, you're doing a test control, and you found on average the training improved the openness. Do you find that there are either certain personal characteristics or organizational barriers that get in the way for some individuals as opposed to others?
Sure, that's a great question. And it's one that I can easily piggyback into answering Paul Snyderman's question as well. So if you start with kind of the initial study where we were looking at traits of curiosity, that's something that's fairly stable. And what organizations will often do is they will select for individuals that are going to be high in that trait of curiosity. In fact, a famous example of that was Google. Google used to pay for these billboards where they would have these really kind of esoteric math problems or engineering problems. And so there would be kind of an equation followed by .com. And if you could figure out the answer to that equation and then you wrote in the answer followed by .com, it would take you to a website that said, "We're Google. We're glad you found us. We would like to find you." So they were looking for people that were kind of problem finders, people that were naturally curious, and they were using this as a filter to select these people into the organization. And that's exactly what we were kind of looking at when we were looking at the call centers, is we were just seeing there's going to be some variance in people that are more or less curious. And if we look at that variance, that's going to cause variance in terms of the behaviors that people enact and the performance outcomes. When we're looking at these sorts of experiments like the Houdini experiment and the experiment with this organization that's trying to solve homelessness, what we're doing there is we're randomizing people into completely different groups. And by doing that, that normalizes more high curious people in each group. So there's going to be kind of a similar distribution of people in each. And so then what we can do is look at, on average, controlling for those sorts of differences. Are people more curious as a result of the training that we've given them or the stimulus we've given them with the Houdini bit? So to kind of circle back then to Paul's question, Paul's right. What you want is this combination of state and trait curiosity. Now, people that are high in trait curiosity, they're also more susceptible to experience states of curiosity more frequently and more intensely. So what you want to do is you do want to recruit for people that are curious if that's what your organization wants. But then as a manager, what you want to do is begin to implement practices that allow people to explore that curiosity. So that could be things like what Olivetti was doing, where they will kind of purposely endorse things that seem a little bit tangential to the core goals of the organization, but with the idea of kind of opening people up to more stimuli, more surprises, and then allow them to ask bigger questions. So it's both recruiting for people, but then also creating management practices and a culture where you're allowing people to be curious and not just rewarding them for the behavior. I mean, you can definitely do that, but as leaders, modeling the sorts of behaviors that are more inviting to people being curious.
Right. We have another question, which is sort of a follow-up to that too, which is, what if you're in a situation where you're curious as an employee, but your manager is not so curious, not at all curious? And any suggestions for an employee or a person in that kind of a situation?
So that's a very tricky situation, and that's a question that sadly I hear all too frequently.
Yeah.
The difficulty with that, and with curiosity in a work setting in particular, has to do with kind of what we were playing with the go back protocol. By asking questions at work, especially in a setting where it's not valued or a manager doesn't value curiosity, it can feel very threatening to other people, because what your curiosity is doing is it's allowing people to see that the organization itself isn't as stable as they want to believe that it is. In interviews that I've done with people, even at extremely creative organizations, I mean, if you think about kind of the top innovative companies on Forbes' list of the most innovative companies or the Fortune list of the 100 best companies to work for, some of those most innovative companies, people will freely admit that the organization itself is really kind of held together by duct tape in some places, where somebody has kind of MacGyvered a really cool solution to an ongoing problem. And when people realize that things are held together in that sort of a potentially flimsy way, it leads to all sorts of questions. How did this solution come about? Why aren't we using a more robust strategy here? Is this a matter of resources or importance? And asking those sorts of questions, if it's asked to somebody who doesn't want you to be curious, can be very threatening, because to them what it reveals is limitations of what they're doing. So what we need to do is create a safe space for people to feel curious themselves. And part of that can be by being really supportive relationally, so that they understand that you support them and they won't see your curiosity as an opportunity to tear them down. The other thing is that curiosity usually works best when it's allowed to coexist with other competencies. So imagine if you're very curious, but you're also extremely conscientious. So you know all the details, you follow through on all the assignments that are given you, then you're given more leeway. But if you're low in conscientiousness, where you're not somebody that kind of follows up on all of these things and you kind of leave things undone, then the message that you're sending your manager is, I'm curious and I'm doing that instead of doing these other important assignments that I have. And so I think that that's kind of the trick, is making sure that you're kind of checking the important boxes for your manager and then showing how curiosity is something that's additive and helping the organization. And once they get a few instances of that, then they're going to be a little bit more open to curiosity itself.
So you talked about some of the trickiness and balancing different ways of becoming or exhibiting curiosity in your company, and given some of the negative things to watch out for. Any other suggestions about negatives to watch out for?
In terms of
exhibiting too much curiosity, is there something that you would give some guidance to people about how it can actually work against you? Or you've covered some of those already. I'm just wondering if there are any others where there could be negative performance outcomes.
So let me describe a little bit more. We did a study with a very famous organization that is kind of commonly presented as one of the top organizations to work for over the last decade. And what we wanted to find out was how do they allow new ideas to come into this organization? And so we actually followed new recruits to the organization for a year, and we interviewed them 4 times over the course of their first year. And we also interviewed people that they worked with at the organization 4 times over the course of the year. So we were both getting the insider's perspective and the newcomer's perspective. And what we found was that even at this super innovative company that espouses a culture where they let 1,000 flowers bloom and they let each new idea fend for itself, that actually wasn't really the case when it came down to the individual presenting the new idea. What they had to do was develop what we ended up calling a relational cocoon, where you develop a friendship with somebody, usually at your same level, where you can begin to share ideas that are outside ideas that might be threatening to people inside, but because you have such a strong relationship, you can share that idea with that person, and that person can then help you develop that idea so that when it's eventually expressed to a broader group of people in the organization, it no longer sounds like an outside idea. It actually sounds like an idea that's been growing inside that organization the entire time. So a lot of the things that help get rid of the potential negative consequences of curiosity have to do with how we develop relationships and how we manage our tasks and our competencies so that people see us as contributors. And as long as you have the strong relationships and the strong sense of contribution, then people are willing to give you a little bit more latitude to explore different things. But when those things aren't in place, then what curiosity looks like is time wasting, right? So it doesn't look like, wow, you're exploring another industry during lunch. It just looks like, oh, you're surfing random websites. Why aren't you focused on your tasks? And so I think that that's the thing, is that people are going to judge you on competence first. And if you're trying to have them judge you on curiosity first, then they're probably going to see it more as a time-wasting activity rather than something that is building competencies for greater adaptability in the future.
Great. I think a lot of our questions are around those kind of issues of how to stretch the boundaries or be curious but not go too far. I think you've covered several of the things people have raised. Well, in terms of application, when you're interviewing people, can you give some guidance on what are the kind of things you listen for identifying candidates that would be curious and in the right amount of curiosity, not so much necessarily that they get themselves into trouble, but those that you would ideally like to have in an organization?
Yeah, so one of the things that the founder of IDEO talks about quite a bit is hiring what they call T people. So if you imagine the letter T, you've got the horizontal bar and then the vertical axis. The idea with a T person is that that vertical axis is depth of knowledge. So you're hiring somebody in an area where you want to have deep expertise. But if you just get somebody that's a siloed expert, they're not going to be able to talk to other people that are in different functions or that have different interests. And so that's where that horizontal bar comes. It shows that the people have broad interests, that outside of work, it might be that my job is as a graphic designer, but outside of work, I'm kayaking, I'm a parent, I'm engaged with the local school. And so you have a lot of different interests. And the important thing there is that allows you to better connect with other people. So then it's kind of generating interview questions that allow you to assess, do these people have the level of expertise I want? But then if I switch them to a different scenario, are they able to explore that scenario? Do they show kind of a willingness to do new things, to try new things, and to look at the world with a little bit of a sense of wonder? I'll often do that when I'm selecting doctoral students. These are people that as their job, they're meant to research and ask new questions. And I'll kind of get them to explain what it is they're really interested in. And then I'll give them a scenario where imagine there were organizations on Mars and they wanted you to come study them. What would happen? And for some kind of what I would call lesser curious people, they just kind of persist with the exact same questions. I was interested in leadership before, I'll still just explore leadership. the more curious people are going to get to more fundamental things like, wow, in Mars, like what would their language be like? What's their clothing like? Do you think they listen to the same sort of music? Is Friday the day that they go hang out, or do they actually do that on Tuesday? Are their Fridays the same length as ours? And they start kind of getting into these broader sorts of questions. So I think it's kind of this ability to think about what is the core competency you're hiring for and making sure you're getting that. But then on top of that, are you getting people that have breadth and that have interest in other areas? If they were left with an extra 6 hours in the day, would they just keep focusing on the exact same content, or would they go do different things?
That's great. So flip that around now. Suppose we take the perspective of the person applying for a job or developing their career. What, if any, advice can you give at this point? Or how do you develop those kind of capabilities individually, or the ability to stretch your own curiosity muscles, as one of our questioners says?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think one thing that you can do with kind of brand new recruits coming out of a university is asking them for their favorite class and seeing if that class was outside of the status quo. If you're hiring an accountant and their favorite class is an accounting class, then they're probably going to be a really, really good accountant. But if you wanted somebody that was curious, then they're probably going to say something like photography or poetry or their math class, right? I mean, something that's going to be a little bit outside of the area. The other thing to look at is how do they tell stories? I mean, curious people are kind of more interested in these sorts of, the sixth sense, kind of throwing some mystery into what it is they're explaining to you and kind of drawing you into that story and then providing a little bit of a reveal. And so that's something else, is kind of just listening to how are they describing what they do. Is it all a very linear process, or there are these fun twists and turns where they've kind of moved around and they've done different things? If you look at kind of more established employees, more and more we're seeing that people have these sorts of boundaryless careers where they move around organizations more often. And getting the narrative of why they're doing that can be really telling. So are they moving around just because it's always this is the next best opportunity, or is it because they're growing their skill base and they're kind of broadening who they are and what they're capable of? So those sorts of things can be really important in interviews as well.
Right. Are there specific published accounts or literature or books that you might recommend to people that want to follow up on some of those things specifically, the sort of self-training aspect?
There are. In fact, there's been an explosion recently on books on curiosity. And one in particular that's interesting that kind of gets at the just kind of the practice behind curiosity and how we can kind of behave ourselves into being more curious is by Brian Fraser. So he's an executive producer in Hollywood, and he started having what he called these curiosity conversations with the actors and the directors and the other producers that he would work with in Hollywood. And so he has a book called A Curious Mind. Now, it's not the most well-written book, and it's definitely not kind of like a Malcolm Gladwell sort of tour de force, but it is very practical in terms of thinking, how can I have conversations with people that evoke more curiosity, where I kind of get new ideas out of them and better understand what's going on. There's also a really fun book that's on the Mars rover named Curiosity. So it's called Mars Rover Curiosity, an inside account from Curiosity's chief engineer. And that's an amazing story itself, just because if you think about launching a rover to Mars, there's so much precision involved in that it would seem like this ability to kind of be a little bit more exploratory and be more open-ended, that there's very little tolerance for that. But as you go through that story of how they're actually able to make curiosity work, you realize that even in these sorts of organizations where you have to be pinpoint accurate, curiosity actually enables that accuracy more often than not. So those are two really good ones to think about. I think another one that is kind of interesting is a book that was actually written by our dean here at Boston College called Virtuoso Teams, where he talks about kind of innovative teams and what they're able to do together. And although he doesn't talk about curiosity specifically, the traits for these teams really kind of call attention to management practices that anybody in any organization could put in place that would allow their teams to evoke more curiosity in them. So that, I mean, that's just a smattering.
Yep.
If people wanted to send me emails, I could definitely provide kind of a larger library of curiosity.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And yeah, if any in the audience want to ask further questions or get more references, things you'd like to discuss, we do invite you to reach out to Spencer at harrissx@bc.edu. And with that, I think we're right at about time. So, and hopefully we got to all the questions or pretty much all of them. If there are further ones, feel free to follow up directly. So thank you very much to Spencer. Appreciate it. And just to let you know our schedule, our next webinar for MSI is going to be tomorrow, the 15th of February at noon Eastern Time. And we'll feature Ninja Goes from NYU. So once again, many thanks to the members of the MSI audience for participating in our member-to-member webinar series, and thanks a lot to Spencer Harrison.
Thank you.